Within this video, I'm going to show you how to make a canvas smoother than paper. I'm also going to show you a few smooth surface alternatives to canvas such as MDF, panels, and traditional rag paper. All these surfaces can be used for oil paint and acrylics, drawing mediums like graphite, charcoal, pastels, and colored pencils, and in my opinion is a perfect surface for airbrush paintings. Now, I made a video last summer showing you how to set up a smooth canvas, but I keep getting a lot of questions, so the purpose of this video is just to go into more detail. On the screen now, you're going to see three surfaces. The image on the left is a store-bought canvas from Blick, and this is our high-end Premier cotton canvas. In the middle is the same canvas after we apply these techniques to smooth it out. And on the right side of the screen, you can see a piece of copy paper. So this canvas is basically smoother than the actual copy paper. It's difficult to show how smooth this canvas really is through YouTube, but I'm going to try to show you another example here using some graphite. So on the store-bought canvas, you can see that we get a surface that looks like this. It's pretty rough, even though it's sold or marketed as a smooth canvas. After we're done using our technique on the same canvas, you can see that the surface is completely different. The texture of the canvas was removed and the surface is perfectly smooth. If I haven't convinced you yet, let me show you the same thing on a piece of paper. When I remove the paper, you can see that the canvas underneath is basically the same texture. So if you're used to drawing or painting on hot press paper, you're going to absolutely love this surface. Now, there's nothing difficult about preparing this canvas, but I just want to point out, since you're using gesso, this can get very messy. So make sure you get some tarps or some drop cloths, something to protect your floors or your tables. You could start this process with any store-bought canvas like this one that I purchased from Blick Art Supply. I love painting on canvas, but I don't like painting on canvas that's stretched over stretcher bars. On smaller paintings, maybe anything under a foot, this may be okay for some people, but I just find canvas over stretcher bars to be way too flimsy, and I like a more rigid surface. Now, of course, this is all personal preference, but to me, stretcher bars are great to display and show artwork, but they're not a great surface to actually paint on. So what I like to do is stretch my canvas over MDF, and then once I'm finished with the painting and it's varnished, I can remove it from the MDF and place it over some stretcher bars. If you're unfamiliar with MDF, it stands for medium density fiberboard. And this surface is very inexpensive, and you can purchase it at any place that sells lumber. I live in the United States, so I buy it at Home Depot. You can purchase it in any size you like. I'm using 1/4 inch here, which is 2 feet by 4 feet, but it's also sold in 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch, and you can even buy large sheets of 4 feet by 8 feet. Home Depot is really great too because they'll cut it to any size you like. I just buy a bunch of these sheets and then cut it when I need it. One of the reasons I really love MDF is because I can cut it to any size I'd like. But if you don't feel like doing this, you could of course just buy some panels that you could purchase online or any art store. And these panels will work exactly the same. You could stretch the canvas over them, or you could paint directly on them. If you're wondering why I paint on canvas rather than directly on the MDF or the panel, it's because when I need to ship it, it's a lot easier to ship a canvas. With canvas, you could paint as large as you like, and then when you need to ship it somewhere, it's very easy to roll up and place in a tube. So before I show you the techniques for smoothing the canvas, I'm going to show you the way I stretch it. There's a bunch of stores online that you can order your canvas from. I order it from a place called Big Canvas, and I obviously have no connection with that company, but they're just a place I've been ordering from the last few years, and I'd recommend them. The canvas that I purchased is Cotton Duck 15 ounce, and I usually order it in large rolls of around 20-25 yards. Take a look around and find a canvas that you might like. I'll have links down below for some that I recommend. If you're stretching your own canvas like I'm doing here, don't buy canvas that has gesso pre-applied to it. There's no need for it. Once you have your canvas cut to size, I like to use a stapler to attach it to the MDF, and I highly recommend this 12-volt Milwaukee one, but a pneumatic one will work just as well. I also recommend a pair of canvas pliers to pull the canvas tight. Stretching your canvas over the MDF is very easy to do. The first step is to place one staple in each of the 4 sides. This way you have the canvas secured to the MDF, and then from here we could stretch it and tighten it up. At this point, we don't have to worry about getting the canvas tight. As we switch over to the pliers, we'll pull it down tight and secure it with staples. To stretch the canvas evenly, it's best to place staples around each one of the corners instead of pulling one end tight. You want to make sure the MDF is clean before you start to do this. Make sure there's no gouges or chips in it. And then once you stretch the canvas on, you can see that I go around every other corner and pull it tight. This is very easy to do. You just want to pull it tight with the pliers and hold it with your other hand and put one staple in. I put about maybe 5 to 10 staples on each side. If you're going to re-stretch your canvas on stretcher bars after the painting's complete, I recommend that you leave more canvas on the back. This way you have way more options of what type of stretcher bars you could place it on, because if you have thicker ones and the canvas is too short, there's no way you could ever add extra canvas to it. Now, this is a smaller canvas, but no matter the size, stretching is pretty quick. It usually takes me 5-10 minutes max. Once you're done with this, you're ready to start priming it. In traditional oil painting, you'd want to size the canvas before applying any sort of ground or gesso. Traditional sizing like rabbit skin glue was mainly used to help tighten the canvas and also provide a barrier between the canvas and the layers of paint. Modern acrylic gessos do a great job at preventing any of the paint from penetrating into the canvas. So in this case, we're only going to be using gesso. You want to make sure that you're using a high quality acrylic gesso. My favorite is made by Liquitex. Their student grade gesso called Liquitex Basics is also excellent. Now, over the years, I've used a lot of different gessos, and I recommend staying away from almost all student grade gessos besides Liquitex Basics. Most of them seem to have a weak binder and a low pigment load, so it makes the next few steps very difficult. This is just my opinion, but I think the best two gessos out there today are made by Golden Acrylics and Liquitex Professional. In order to get the canvas very smooth, we're going to need a few supplies, so the first thing we're going to need are some taping knives. These are very important because what we're doing with these is we're pushing the gesso into any of the low points of the canvas. Any type of taping knife will work fine. I recommend the larger ones because you don't have to do as many passes with them. Since we're preparing a small canvas here, a taping knife is the perfect tool, but when I'm setting up larger canvases, I like to use these floor squeegees. Of course these aren't necessary, but if you're setting up a very large canvas, maybe 5 feet or bigger, this makes the process so much easier and quicker. And this tool works essentially the same as the taping knife, just on a larger scale. Now I like to use some small inexpensive rollers because you can lay a lot of the gesso on the canvas, which is what we want. While I'm putting the gesso on the canvas, I'm not worrying about being neat at all. I just want to lay a thick amount of gesso across the whole surface. We're going to be applying about 8 to 10 coats of gesso, so it's a good idea to put the roller in a small Ziploc bag in between coats. This way the roller won't dry up and the gesso will stay fresh for each layer. Now what you want to do here is take the taping knife and gently glide it over the surface of the gesso. As I do this, I'm not applying any pressure to the taping knife. It's basically just floating over the surface. Now this is where people got confused in my last video, so I'm going to open up a Photoshop document to show you a basic idea of what we're doing here. Here I cut off a thin piece of canvas and I took a photo of it using a macro lens. By no means is this photo perfect, but this should give you a good idea of what the canvas weave or texture looks like. If we just use a roller or a brush to apply the gesso to the canvas, we're not really smoothing it out. What's happening is the gesso is getting down into the low points and then it's also sitting on top of the high points. So what we get is basically the exact same canvas texture, just raised higher. Now instead, if we use a taping knife to apply the gesso, we get a very smooth surface like this because the gesso gets pushed down into the low points. So the taping knife's actually doing all the work. The reason that we sand it at the end is just to clean up any imperfections that we get from that taping knife. While I'm using the taping knife to remove the gesso, I'm never holding it at a sharp angle like this. What I'm doing is laying it flat like this. When you lay it flat and pull it over the gesso, it's just going to float over the top of it. This way it's going to level out that top layer of gesso, but it's not going to remove all of it. So you're still going to have a good amount of gesso on the canvas. So going back to our real canvas, you can see that I'm using zero pressure and just gliding this across the surface. What I love about the larger taping knives is that I only need 2 passes to smooth this canvas out. Any excess gesso that was pulled off with the taping knife can go right back into the gesso bucket and you can save it for the next coat. This way you're not wasting anything. For the second pass, you want to make sure your taping knife is clean, and then we're going to do the same thing, just lightly pull it over the surface. This time I'm using a little bit more pressure toward the left side of the canvas. This way the right side isn't cutting into the gesso. So this first coat of gesso is done, so what I like to do is just clean off my taping knife using some water and some shop towels. This way my rollers and my taping knife are ready to go for the second coat in about a half hour. So 30 minutes later, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Add some gesso with the roller and then pull it off with the taping knife. Setting up a smooth canvas is very easy to do. The only thing is it's time consuming and it's messy. To get the canvas very smooth, you need an absolute minimum of 5 coats, but I recommend more. I usually apply about 10 coats of gesso. So for me, this is something that I'll do over the course of a day while working on something else. Every half hour, I'll come back, apply a coat of gesso on it, and then remove it. If the gesso is too liquidy and the viscosity feels too thin, what you could do is apply the gesso with the roller and then let it sit on the canvas for about 2 minutes, no more than that. This way it's going to tack up on that surface, and then when you remove it with the taping knife, it's going to be a little bit easier than it would when it was very wet. So that's the basics for applying this. You want a minimum of about 8 to 10 coats. Trust me on that. The more coats you have, the better it's going to be. I understand that it's time consuming, but if you spend that day doing it, you're going to get an absolute perfect surface. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to let this sit overnight, about 24 hours or so, and then the next day, what we're going to do is we're going to sand it. If you apply the gesso on correctly, the next day your canvas should look like this. As you can see, there's plenty of imperfections in it. There's some lines and some streaks from the taping knife. None of this is going to be a problem because we're going to sand this off, but as you can see, all of that canvas texture is completely covered. You can't see any of the canvas weave through the gesso. We're going to be wet sanding the canvas, but you don't need an expensive sandpaper. I'm just going to be using some inexpensive 120 grit and a sanding block. In the spray bottle here, I have distilled water, and it's important to use distilled rather than tap water. If you go to any supermarket, you could buy it. It's usually like $1 or so, so pick that up. So with this distilled water, I'm essentially saturating the whole canvas. You want to put a lot of water on there. That's going to make sanding it so much easier than if it's dry. If you'd like to, you could even just take a gallon of distilled water and pour some of it on there. That works fine too. This is definitely one of the messiest parts of it, so I like a spray bottle because I can control where I put the water a little bit more than just by pouring it out with a gallon. You can't add too much water for this. If you add too much, it's just going to pour off the sides. Just remember, the more water you have on the surface, the better it's going to be. So with this 120 grit wrapped over my sanding block, I'm sanding the whole surface in circular motions, and I'm applying almost no pressure, just very lightly, kind of scuffing the surface. Since this gesso has been drying for less than a day, it's not fully cured yet. It's dry, but it's not cured. So what happens is when you spray water on it and you sand into it, you're kind of activating it. So some of the gesso, the top few layers of it, are going to become wet, and they're going to kind of move around on the surface. And if there's any low points in there, they're going to kind of fill it in, and any of the high points are going to get knocked down with that sandpaper. So if you're doing this right, you're going to see that the whole surface of the canvas kind of has this milky-like appearance to it. That's the activated gesso that's forming a slurry on the surface, and that's what you want. Once I have the whole surface sanded down, I'm going to switch back over to my taping knife, and this is an easier way to clean that slurry off the canvas. While you're sanding, if you notice that any of this activated gesso is starting to dry in some sections of the canvas, just add some more water and that'll help you out. After about a minute or so of sanding, I'm switching back to my taping knife, and just like before, I'm pulling all this slurry off the surface. Now here I'm using a lot of pressure. You don't have to worry about cutting into it like when we were doing it with the wet gesso, because the gesso underneath, the activated gesso, is still going to be dry, so you could use a lot of pressure to pull this off clean. After this part's done, you're going to notice that there's still some of that slurry on the surface. Most of it's gone from the taping knife, but there's still some left over. So what I do is switch over to either a microfiber cloth or a shop towel, and then just polish this all into the canvas. I just go around the entire canvas in small circular motions, and this is going to really polish it and give you that smooth paper-like finish. At this point you could stop and you're going to have a nice smooth canvas, but what I like to do is switch now to 200 grit sandpaper and then do the same thing again. When you sand it the first time with either 100 or 120 grit, you're going to knock down all the high points and you're going to get a smooth canvas, but what's going to happen is some of that sandpaper is going to leave some lines and some scratches in the canvas. So this next step of polishing it with the 200 grit is just going to clean those all up. In most cases, sanding it the first time with 120 grit is more than enough. But if you want it one step smoother like I do, try this 120 grit, just same thing as before, very light pressure with a lot of water on the surface. In my opinion, there's no need to ever go above 200 grit. This is going to be as smooth as you'd ever need. If you wanted to keep going up the grits, 300, 500, 800, all the way up, you'll basically get it as smooth as glass, and there's absolutely no reason for that. 200 grit is the perfect stopping point for me, and like I said, it's basically going to feel like hot pressed paper. And once you remove the slurry with the taping knife and polish it with a cloth, you're done. I recommend allowing this to sit for another day or so. This way, all that gesso underneath is going to fully cure and you'll be ready to paint on it. So hopefully this video went into more detail than my previous one and helped some of you guys out that were having trouble with this or had some questions. Hopefully this video answered them for you. Now, a few things I want to point out. If you're thinking that you could just buy a store-bought canvas and then wet sand it, you'll never get it as smooth as this. You could of course use any store-bought canvas that has gesso pre-applied to it, but what you're going to need to do is apply extra coats of gesso, another 10 coats, using that taping knife. Because when gesso is applied on the canvas from a store-bought one, it's not pushed into those low grooves that we get when we apply it with the taping knife. So when you're sanding it, you're just sanding the high points off, and so you're still going to have that low points, and that texture is always going to be there. The key to all this is really using that taping knife and getting those low points filled in with gesso. And unfortunately, there's no fast way to do this. The good news is it's easy. Everyone could do it. It's just going to take you some time. If you want to save some time, you could apply the gesso directly to the MDF. Now you're only going to need 2 coats of gesso because MDF is a very smooth surface to begin with. However, there's a few problems with painting directly on MDF, and it's a great surface if you want to, do some practice paintings, but in the long run, I don't think it's a great surface. The first problem is that MDF is very soft, so if you ding it on something or you drop it, it's very easy to damage the surface. So if you spent a long time working on a painting, it's not as durable as it's going to be on canvas. Also, MDF is very dense and it's really, really heavy. So if you're doing a large painting and you're doing it all on MDF, the thing's going to weigh, 20, 30 pounds or more. And trying to ship this like I've done before is so expensive. So if you're working on smaller ones, it's a great surface, but I don't recommend it for anything over, 4 feet or so. The second major problem is that there's no way that MDF is an archival surface. Since it's a man-made product, there's a lot of adhesives and binders within the surface of the MDF. So there's no way that this is going to be good for your paint in the long run. Who knows how it's going to affect it, if it's going to alter the color of the paint or if the paint's going to start deteriorating. I'm not sure, but it's not as safe as canvas, which has been proven for, hundreds of years. But with that said, I've made many paintings on MDF and I think it's such a great surface to work on. Just understand that in the long run, it's probably not the ideal surface for painting. And the last issue with MDF is that no matter how well you clean the surface, after you apply multiple coats of gesso, you're going to notice that there's a slight discoloration to the gesso. It's not pure white, slightly off-white. This is because there's contaminants on the surface and they kind of contaminate the gesso and just slightly shift the color. It's not a huge deal, but it's definitely noticeable when you compare it to a canvas. Golden Paints has a whole article on this and they call it surface-induced discoloration, and what they recommend is using a gloss or a matte medium over the surface before you apply the gesso. So it's up to you if you want to do that. So my recommendation is that if you're working on art that you're going to display or sell, stick with canvas. It's a better long-term solution. But if you're looking to do some practice work and you want to set up a surface very quickly, go with the MDF. And of course you could swap out MDF for any store-bought panel and that works just as well too. So that's going to complete this video. I wish you the best of luck in your paintings. And if you're looking for the smoothest canvas possible, make sure you try this technique. I guarantee you're going to love it. As always, thank you so much for watching.